Hey guys, it's me Mug, and before I begin this review, a quick disclaimer. If you are sensitive to performance on consoles, I recommend that you check out a more in-detailed breakdown of the performance of Dragon's Dogma 2 on consoles. When it comes to PC, I think that you should probably wait for a patch to guarantee that the game is going to work on a wider configuration of hardware than the 4090s that most content creators use. As far as the microtransactions and the fiasco regarding that, I don't think that they affect the game, but they do exist, and if that bothers you, that's a completely valid opinion, and I support your decision to not buy the game because of that, just as much as I support people who decide to play it despite that. This review is completely spoiler-free. I won't show anything that wasn't shown in trailers, and I'm going to limit the footage I show from the second half of the game as much as possible, and this is more of a consumer-oriented review. If you're looking for my very in-depth analysis of the game, it will be coming soon, or depending on when you're watching this video, already be up on my channel in the long-form analysis playlist. With all of that out of the way, let's get into the review. Dragon's Dogma 2, much like the first game, is a game that I love. It's one of the best video games I've played, and it's also a game that is frustrating, awkward, annoying, unique, repetitive, compelling, lacking content, and somehow still bloated. It's a game that is lacking in many areas. It feels half-decided on its vision in other areas, and some of the design decisions are straight up confusing in their intentions, and they lead to awful results. And at the same time, it manages to be uncompromising in its most core aspects, and creates a game that is a dream come true to many people, including me. The most surprising part about it is how much of a sequel it is to the first game. I've heard many review bylines qualify this game as a redo, a second shot at the first game and not a proper sequel. And to me, that's a very lazy way of explaining a much more complicated thing. What is a sequel if not an iteration upon that which came before? Because that is precisely what this game is. What's fascinating about it is how in that iteration it stumbles onto completely new issues, but falls into the same exact final problem. Dragon's Dogma was an incredibly unique take on the action RPG genre, filtered through an adventuring Dungeons & Dragons lens that came out with some crucial flaws in its take on an open world and lacking some more depth in its survival mechanics, as well as its overall balance and how it rewarded the player. Dragon's Dogma 2 patches up all the main issues I had with the original Dragon's Dogma, but what really makes it a sequel is how many things it not only transforms from the first, but how many additional things it adds. And in all those additions, it introduces an entirely new host of flaws that now require patching up. And just like the first game, it leads to something that many people will bounce off of. I'd wager it's going to be just as divisive as the first, but those who connect with the game will find something so unique, so special, that it will create a whole new cycle of fans that will wait another 12 years for Dragon's Dogma 3 to correct these new flaws, and introduce some new ones, I guess. It's not so much a case of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Instead, it's a case of 10 steps forward, and 5 of those were taken a bit off balance, and a couple of them were just in the wrong direction. So let's start off with the positive, the things I love about this game. The combat system to me is the best ever put into an open world RPG. It's Monster Hunter by way of Devil May Cry. It's fast, flashy, satisfying, and it takes advantage of the pawns with your 4-man party excellently. It has its own twists on an individual level for each of the vocations in the game. It refines and improves every single one to make them all spectacular to play or even just witness in action. And I'll go much more in-depth on that in my full-fledged analysis. There's even more I think that this combat system could achieve, and I wish there were a larger variety of enemies to use this combat system on, but it never fails to impress, and it never got boring in the 45 hours I put in before making this review. And quite the contrary, I'm excited to head back in and finish maxing out every vocation. For as much as I adore Elden Ring's combat, or Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's underutilized combat, or even things like Assassin's Creed and its RPG trilogy or the Ghost of Tsushima style of combat, nothing comes close to the addictive feeling of satisfaction that pressing any button in Dragon's Dogma 2 provides. The dramatic changes to the open world are also something I love, and overall a win. This is a game where exploration is rewarded, where there's just as much missable content, if not more, than content that the game signposts. This goes a very long way in making the core loop of the game, which is normally setting out on an adventure with a destination in mind and getting sidetracked into adventures, all the tighter and well executed. But this is an area where many problems are introduced as well, and we'll get into them in a bit. But this is a game where you can spend an hour exploring a cave, leave, see yourself stranded at night, lit up by your lamp but still unable to see 3 feet ahead of you, having run out of healing and supplies and with no way to rest out in the middle of nowhere. And that's when you think, I have to find a way back home. I desperately need to get to the nearest town. And that very simple concept of returning to town can become an adventure and a story worth telling. No game I've ever played conveys that feeling of adventure, those sorts of things we see in films like The Lord of the Rings or in great novels or manga, better than Dragon's Dogma 2 does. The questing in the game is often more comparable to an immersive sim, with some ingenious quests that really allow the player to find their own solutions to the problems the game presents. And for as much as this could frustrate people, it also leads to a sense of satisfaction when finding a creative solution that no amount of fanfare or loot could compete with. It masterfully creates scenarios for the player to finish a quest and smile, just because you feel smart when you do it, in a way that I wish more RPGs would do. And this is done here in a game that lacks any in-depth dialogue trees or thousands of code and scripting potential relationships like Baldur's Gate 3 or Mass Effect might. It's done with a subdued elegance that makes those solutions just as rewarding as in those other games, but in a very different way. And with the design chops to make the game work even when it includes mechanics where the main questline can be completely broken by having characters die. And don't worry, I want to talk about that, but in a separate video. If you kill everyone, the game can keep going. You just have to find the way to do so. It's that philosophy of living with the consequences of your actions that sets it apart, while also offering replay value to discover the other ways that you could solve the problems that it presents. And finally, one of the things I love the most and that not enough people are talking about is how it's way better balanced than the first. Than most RPGs, honestly. The dual system of player level that you have and the vocation ranks, which are your classes and how they can rank up individually, creates a very addictive gameplay hook. And when it's all held up thanks to that combat, you consistently enjoy leveling up and exploring new classes. And it always feels like you're progressing towards a goal, without ever needing to prop up a huge experience bar. In many games, after reaching mid-level, your progress feels dreadfully slow, as is the case with Dragon's Dogma 1. But here, I felt like I was always just a bit away from a significant improvement. Be that through the levels, through ranks, or through gear, and that creates a more refined momentum from the first game that had me excited to keep playing. All of these systems, how they connect and how they achieve this, is one of the best parts of this game. And truly there is so much that I love about it. But there's two sides to each coin, and this isn't an exception. For everything that it expands on and fixes from the first game, and for as many cues as it takes from myriad games that have evolved this genre in the last 12 years, it stumbles terribly in many aspects that make it seem like they only took certain cues from the best of the best, but failed to implement them in their unique vision for the game. There's no better example to this than the design of the open world. The game can broadly be divided into two halves, which happen in two large distinct regions. But throughout the whole game, the open world can best be described as a series of hallways that lead to small areas of exploration. If on one extreme you might have something like a semi-open world or an open area game like God of War Ragnarok or Final Fantasy VII Remake, and on the other you have things like Tears of the Kingdom, Dragon's Dogma 2 often feels like God of War Ragnarok in the body of Zelda. Most of the world has paths that clearly separate regions, and while some have shortcuts and clever ways to get past them, most of the time you are picking a path and that path will have small branches for exploration that connect back to the main path in one way or another. The game is at its best when those side paths lead to entirely new discoveries or create new paths. But that isn't what you'll encounter the most of. Instead, they will be a short diversion from the path you're intended to take, with a chest or two. When you combine this design with the lack of fast travel and the cost of it, you will spend a long time simply walking from place to place. On these walks, you might try and take a different path and find that it leads nowhere, or to one of those very small side areas. But when you're on the path, it's the same enemies on the same path, over and over again. One of the most common ways of organizing your goals in the game is to take ox carts from one major city to another, and group all the activities around that city for the trip. So you'll end up using those ox carts a lot. The first time that your fast travel is interrupted by a raid of enemies and you must wake in the middle of the night to defend the cart, you'll find it refreshing. The first time that combat results in a broken cart, leaving you in the middle of your trip at night for you to finish the often 10 minutes or more of the journey that you have left on foot, it'll be a memorable anecdote. The fifth time this happens, and you must walk down the same path fighting the same enemies with nothing new to encounter, you'll be seriously annoyed. The enemies will chase you all the way to town, so there's no real way to ignore them, and the only saving grace to this is how fun it is to take them down, even when you're absurdly overpowered for the area you're in, and that sense of progression that might result in an extra level on the way. But there is no world where this is fun. It certainly does immerse you in the world and follows the mantra of paying your consequences, but eventually these adventures are not exciting, memorable, or engaging. Nor do they feel like punishments for your decisions. They feel like the game is wasting your time. If the enemy spawns were varied, or that alleged dynamic difficulty system that they have worked to make these encounters more unique or to create interesting encounters on repeat trips, some of this could be mitigated. But that doesn't happen. And there's not really enough enemy variety in the game to really even offer that option. But what is most confusing is how the game didn't consider the element of traversal when they designed a game with this big of a world and this philosophy in moving across it. In Tears of the Kingdom, getting from place to place is fun in itself, because gliding, climbing, and building contraptions to not only explore, but to find the fastest way to your end destination is inherently fun. And because traversal is a core aspect of that game, it might seem unfair to compare it. So instead, I'll explain my biggest problem using Assassin's Creed. I believe that it's the responsibility of a good game to keep the player entertained. And if you ever spend more than 30 seconds without doing something that engages the player, that gets their attention, you've failed. If you spend 30 minutes staring at a puzzle in a game, you're still engaged with how to solve it. If you're just watching cutscenes, but the cutscenes tell a great story, you're still engaged. But if you're holding the analog stick forward for 3 minutes and mindlessly pressing a button to kill enemies that pose no threat, you're not creating something engaging. In the newest trilogy of Assassin's Creed games, the legacy of the previous games gave them an advantage, and that's that walking across the world also means utilizing the game mechanics to jump, climb, and generally do cool stuff on the way to places. You could not do that, but it's your choice not to. The game gives you the power to express yourself creatively and think about what things you could use in your traversal, and ideally it rewards you for it by getting there faster. These little microdoses of engagement keep something as simple as running through the world entertaining. Even if this can grow tiring over hours upon hours, it's something additional in the traversal of the game to make it more engaging. Not to mention that a game like Assassin's Creed or like Elden Ring offer alternative ways of traversal that are much faster and present their own limitations with things like mounts. Dragon's Dogma 2 has nothing beyond repeating the same combat encounters and running. So here's an example of how bad this can get. Your stamina drains faster and you run slower when you move uphill, and it drains less and you move faster when running downhill. This tiny addition was genuinely exciting to me, because it offered something different to observe when mindlessly trekking through areas I had already run through 10 times before. It's not revolutionary. It's simply that I was so deprived of things to interact with, and the charm of the vistas and seeing new things was gone after repeating the same journey 10 times, that this little wrinkle of how stamina and speed interacts with the environment at least was something for me to plan around. In the second area of the game, there are these carts with pulleys, well, lifts I guess, that you can use to travel over the terrain and get to your location faster. You can operate them manually by spinning the stick, or you can get a pawn to do so, and during the trip, you can be attacked by harpies. But the trip can still be 3 or 4 minutes with you doing one mindless thing or another. What's worse, if the lift itself is on the other side of where you are, you have to bring it to your location by spinning the stick, or just waiting for a pawn to do so. And it takes the same time for it to return than it does when you're on it. So you could reach the lift, wait for it to come back, get on, reach the next lift station, and have to bring the next lift to this station to then get on it toward the next station, and you see where I'm going with this. Would it break immersion if the lift were magically on the side of the map that you entered from? Maybe. Also, somebody else could have simply used it. Would it be better, given that this option of the lifts exists, for it to not be the most mindless, annoying thing put in the game? Yes, undoubtedly, yes. It doesn't become more engaging to spend 4 minutes looking at nothing just because I had to press X 3 times when a harpy attacked. I used these lifts twice because of how annoying they are. At least repeating the same trek down on the ground had me occasionally spotting something new or fighting enemies. But if this additional traversal system is so useless, why is it even here? Does it add to the culture of this region? Maybe, yeah, a little bit of lore, and it creates a cool looking atmosphere and vista. But why would you make it so boring to use? It feels like the team was aware of this repetition and the lack of interesting traversal mechanics, and kept it that way. Otherwise, I can't explain how these lifts are in this game like this. Now, I will say that through all of my backtracking, I did manage to have a good time, and when I was actually just completely done with it, I did reach the second half of the game, which I felt was more varied than the first, and everything was exciting and new again, enough to be happy for most of that time. And the game, if at any point you feel like you're getting bored or you're just walking along different places that you've already walked on too much, you can just progress. All you need to do is keep playing, keep going down the main quest line into new regions, and a lot of that backtracking and some of that boredom that can set in through exploration and the repetition of how traversal works in the game will be gone. And I think that Dragon's Dogma 2 does very well in working as a game that's 25 to maybe 30 hours long, in a more beeline of a playthrough filled with excitement and more tension in the fights with you not being overpowered, but it also works decently okay, if with more pain points, as a game for completionists, or maybe you have a YouTube channel where you do very in-depth analysis of games. In a topic that's much more subjective, the world is not visually very interesting. It's beautiful, no doubt, but there's not much for you to drop your jaw and be genuinely wowed at. The two regions of the game feel very different, but also very cohesive inside of them, in a way that ends up making them feel a little flat. Not in design, they're very vertical, but in their visuals. With how much of this world flirts with grander, more high fantasy concepts, I would have liked to see some things that impressed me more. Nothing here really comes close to even the smallest surprises in Zelda, the visual spectacle and colors of Tsushima and its art style, the architecture of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth or most Final Fantasies new and old, the variety in the Xenoblade trilogy, or the scale of Elden Ring. And its best surprises, I would say, hit closer to some of Bethesda Game Studios' best offerings with its towns. There's nothing wrong with the game carving its own identity, a more grounded fantasy world, and I really hate comparing games in general unless it's to contextualize a point about mechanics. But trust me, I'm comparing this time because Dragon's Dogma 2 flirts with a lot of cool ideas that at times reminded me of all of these different examples, sometimes in very specific ways, but never enough to compete. The part that really sours so much of it, though, are the dungeons. They are severely lacking compared to the first game in their designs, their variety, their puzzles, pretty much everything. There's a couple of good ones, later on especially, but nothing comes even close to Bitter Black Isle from Dark Arisen, which is still one of the best dungeons ever put into a game. Most things are just caves or crypts. That's really it. There's some cooler ones, sure, but a lot of just going through a cave, and it never reaches the heights of the first game, and dungeons were the absolute highlight of that game. When you combine these things with how that immersive sim quest design works, the lack of hand-holding, the punishing nature of the game, it's easy to see why so many people will dislike it. On top of that, its story is really not exceptional in writing, in structure, or in most things. There's some highlights to it, but the story itself in totality isn't one of them. Most of the moments I loved were references to the strangest, most creative parts of Dragon's Dogma 1, followed by disappointment at how they'd been changed here. And I acknowledge all of these issues. I'm sad they are here. And I still love this game. It sucks you in, traps you, and keeps you there through its flaws by how well it does what it does well. It's another divisive cult hit with flaws to correct in a sequel that fans will wait for patiently. To me, it's not as unique as the first because of those shades of other games you can see, but when those moments disappoint, I found myself at a crossroads. I would have liked Dragon's Dogma 2 to either carve out a better, more varied, more out there identity that followed in the line of the craziest ideas from the first game, or for it to have taken even more from those other games and added things to circumvent some of the parts of this game that sting the most when playing it. And that's why I say that sometimes the vision of this game feels somewhere in the middle. Maybe they couldn't execute on all of the ideas they had. Maybe this team just dreams too big, or maybe this team got a little lost on the way, but it could have been more. As for if you should play it, yes, maybe not now, maybe not until a sale, and you maybe won't like it. I really want you to know that. But if you do, or if what I'm talked about over many videos on this game is appealing to you, what's here is so special, unique, and utterly transfixing that it's worth finding out if it's for you. Because while I wish some things were different, while I wish dungeons were better, the world was more varied, there were more enemies and less time wasting, I will remember this game for each special trip, every journey that ended with a surprise and me and my party making it out at the last second. For every incredible fight filled with spectacle and badass combos, every piece of beautiful gear, every clever solution to a quest, every new discovery that did surprise me. All of the good severely outweighs the bad. For me. It might not. For you. But I think it's worth taking the chance. So I'll have a lot more to say about this game in that big analysis. You could even consider this review a bit of a preview for that one since it's already half written, and some of the topics are explained just a bit more in depth in the other video. But if you're excited for that and my direct comparison between Dragon's Dogma 1 and 2, make sure to subscribe for my Dragon's Dogma retrospective that's already up on the channel and you can go watch it. And of course I do news and reviews on big upcoming games as well as whatever I want most of the time, so stick around for that. Thank you to my wonderful patrons for supporting my content, and thank you so much for watching this video. It means more than I could ever communicate to you. I've been Mug Thief, and as always, I'll see you again very soon.